Greetings, students. In this video, we're going to pick up where we left off in Napoleon, and we're going to push all the way through the first half of the 19th century. So at the end of the Napoleonic Wars from 1814 to 1815, the nations of Europe met together in Vienna, what we call the Congress of Vienna, drawing up the Treaty of Vienna, the terms to end the Napoleonic Wars, and to figure out what are we going to do with all these countries that have been torn apart. Remember, the Holy Roman Empire was gone. Are they going to let France stay one big country? What about the rivalry between Prussia and Austria? There were a lot of competing interests. Remember, Europe at this point is still mostly a bunch of small little states. But this map here is what they ultimately came up with. That old Dutch Republic was fused with the Austrian Netherlands. That's down here of what will eventually become Belgium. And these two regions were turned into the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Like I said, Napoleon had dismantled the old Holy Roman Empire and created that Confederation of the Rhine, essentially all those small states that are in the western portion of the old Holy Roman Empire, not Prussia and Austria. But the Treaty of Vienna kind of put the Holy Roman Empire back together. It turned that Confederation of the Rhine into what was called the German Confederation. Austria and Prussia were added back to it, and a lot of those old small states were put together into slightly bigger states. The Holy Roman Empire, for at least part of its history, was a couple hundred states large. What they created in this German Confederation, including Prussia and Austria, was only 39 different states. So we can see that fracturing of small German states starting to be put together. And really, the German Confederation was more united than the old Holy Roman Empire. It had a unified army, the German Federal Army, with each state contributing their own troops to their own army corps within it, but they were supposed to work together for their mutual defense. And this is something a lot of other European countries wanted. When they were thinking their own mutual defense, what they were really thinking of was defense from France. Remember, they just got done with a whole generation of fighting France. In most people's minds, that's where the threat's going to come from. There were some worries about Russia as well, just because it was so big, and it is Russia that really got the ball rolling back against Napoleon. That's the reason why France was left big. Essentially, the thought was if you have France on one side and Russia on the other, and all these small states in the middle, it would be too difficult for either of those countries to ever really be able to dominate. They were trying to balance out power. In addition to that unified army, it also had laws for the entire German Confederation that were passed by its Diet. These German diets are really just congresses, legislatures. But this diet wasn't really meant to challenge the sovereignty of all the different monarchs of all the smaller states, especially Prussia and Austria. The old royal family of France, the Bourbons, were put back on the throne. Italy was kept fragmented, but Austria was actually given some of its northern lands, and the Pope was able to get his papal states back, something Napoleon had taken away from him. Over to the east of Prussia, Poland continued to get tossed around like a football. On 3 separate occasions in the late 18th century, parts of Poland had been partitioned between Prussia and Russia. As we're going to see, Poland always finds itself trapped between Germany, Prussia, and Russia. Napoleon had actually recreated it as its own duchy, the Duchy of Warsaw, and turned it into a client state, but the Congress of Vienna ended up giving the Duchy of Warsaw to Russia. Poland is not going to really get any chance to be its own country again until 1918. And that's going to be a short-lived period of independence when Russia and Germany divided up again between each other in 1939, and it won't get its independence again until 1989. Poland gets kicked around a lot during modern European history. In addition to all these new lines, Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed something called the Holy Alliance. This Holy Alliance was really all about maintaining conservatism, to maintain traditional values. Each of these were Christian countries, of course. Prussia was Protestant, Austria was mostly Catholic, and Russia was Eastern Orthodox. So this Holy Alliance was actually not about like those old religious wars where there is disagreements about religion. This Holy Alliance was about maintaining the status quo as it had been before the French Revolution. This Holy Alliance was anti-democracy, anti-liberalism, anti-feminism, and anything else that challenged standing authority. The main purpose of the Holy Alliance was to contain revolutions and revolutionary thought. Now, the Congress of Vienna lasted again from 1814 to 1815, and many statesmen who worked through it had become convinced of a need for an ongoing international order. Prime ministers, foreign ministers, and diplomats began pursuing what came to be called the Concert of Europe. European leaders held regular congresses during the 19th century, and the point of these congresses wasn't necessarily to stop wars, but to keep strict rules over how those wars would be started and conducted. So, for example, before a European state wanted to take over a new colonial possession, before they wanted to go out to Asia or Africa or Australia or wherever, before they could claim that as their own, they essentially had to get permission from everybody else. They had to get the European leaders together to say, yeah, we're all okay with that. Or, Britain, you really have already had quite a bit. Maybe now it's Prussia's turn. Negotiating out ways to carve up the world and paying attention to matters within Europe as well. There was a lot of concern of if one country got a little bit too much land, a little bit too much power, it might get in its mind to take over everything, again, as Napoleon had done beforehand. And so what you often saw was larger countries allying up or helping out smaller countries anytime it seemed like those smaller countries might get taken over and the balance of power get knocked out of whack. The Concert of Europe. It's not an institution, it's not like a place where they all went to go meet, but it was an ideal of how to maintain harmony amongst European powers. Harmony that's going to allow them to pursue some pretty crazy imperialism in the 19th century. And as we're going to see, with the exception of some chaos in the middle of the 19th century, this Concert of Europe worked pretty well all the way up until World War I, when nationalism and imperial competition came to a terrible, violent head. So as we move forward, let's go ahead and start in France, where we have seen so much action in the previous few decades. The return of the royal family, the Bourbons, didn't mean return to the old days of absolutism. Many French folk had grown up as citizens of a republic. They weren't just going to go back to being apolitical subjects that didn't get involved in how their country was ran. So the restored French kings operated underneath the Constitution. There was one that was hammered out, turning them into constitutional monarchs. Kind of like what Britain had had beforehand, what the Revolution had originally created in its first liberal phase. However, this constitution granted the kings of France almost unlimited powers. The king got to a point all had ministers. The French parliament had the authority to pass laws, but the king could decide to execute those laws or just ignore them as he wished. And by the time we get to 1830, the king of France looked like he was making a move to overthrow that constitution. He started passing new laws that cut off any political power of the middle class, and people rose up again. In July of 1830, citizens of Paris took to the streets. It was just like the old days again. You can imagine a lot of people living through this had grown up with stories about the French Revolution from their parents. This is not exactly the French Revolution Part 2, but it is certainly going to define how future revolutionary efforts in France are going to be executed, which really meant building barricades in streets, in these narrow Parisian streets, so that they're able to essentially wall off entire neighborhoods and run their own little mini countries, forcing any soldiers that want to take Paris back to have to not just fight within street fighting, but within barricaded street fighting, where the civilians would actually have homemade cover. And that cover would just be whatever people could bring out of their houses and throw into the streets to block off the roads. And this type of DIY warfare doesn't seem like it should work well, but within 3 days, the royal forces were defeated and the king abdicated. Though I want to emphasize, the people fighting in the streets, most of them weren't necessarily Republicans. They didn't have a problem with having a king, they had a problem with having a dictator. And so in August of 1830, a provisional government invited another king in, a distant cousin of the Bourbons, what we would call a cadet branch of that family. And if this sounds familiar, it should, Because this is almost the same thing that happened during the Glorious Revolution back in England. The one where Parliament got rid of their old king and invited in a new one that they thought would work with them better. This isn't exactly the same thing. It certainly was more bloody than the Glorious Revolution was, but we do see the people, at least the representatives of the people, starting to become a true, legitimate power that kings had to deal with in France. The revolution may have been defeated, but the thing with revolutions is that the seeds that they plant, you never know how they're going to sprout up a generation or two later. Remember this when we get to the 1960s and all that hippie, anti-war, counterculture stuff. This successful revolution in France actually inspired another revolt in the north. Catholics in the southern provinces of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, what used to be the Austrian Netherlands and have been fused together with that old Dutch Republic. Those Catholics down the south also proclaimed their independence from the Protestants in the north. And after a few weeks of fighting, their independence was recognized. This is how we get the Kingdom of Belgium. Now, even though not everybody fighting in that France in July had been a Republican, Republicanism certainly had not disappeared in France. They had societies that they had set up all across the country. These folks actually tried to start another revolution in 1832. The June Rebellion of 1832, Republicans in Paris tried to get things started up. They were defeated after about 2 days of street fighting, though. If you're familiar at all with the musical Les Miserables, you might have heard it called Les Mis, which was originally a book written in the 1800s, that play, that musical, is primarily about that 1832 revolt. But even with that defeat, republicanism didn't disappear. France's cities were growing. The Industrial Revolution was really starting to move a lot of jobs into the cities, where working and middle classes were struggling to get by and starting to realize that they had power in sheer numbers. The ideals of a French nation that really got going in the French Revolution and were solidified underneath Napoleon, they didn't go away. And once you start having all these massive cities with masses in them, big groups of people, these folks that have nationalism on the mind start thinking, wait, aren't we the French nation? Isn't this place supposed to be working for us? There's still a whole lot more lower and middle classes than there are those elites. And it's really these middle and lower class folk who were really thinking about republicanism. That if they're the nation, it's not the king and the grand bourgeoisie who work with the king, the aristocracy. It's just like Rousseau said, it's the people. And they are the bulk of the people. And these French Republicans, they came from many other ideologies. Most of them were liberals, which means they believed in individual liberties. Many of them were socialists, believing that the wealth of society should benefit everybody. Some of them were utilitarians, believing that all policies should be based on the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But again, all of them were nationalists. In 1834, 2 years after the failed June Rebellion, France outlawed Republican societies. And so what ended up happening is, since they couldn't have formal societies, some Republican-minded people would throw banquets, just a dinner party. It just so happened that at that dinner party, everybody that showed up had a Republican mindset and talked about the importance of republicanism and the desire to become a republic again. But they're not a society. They're just throwing a banquet. That spirit of the old revolution was being kept alive. In 1847, there was a large banquet campaign. Essentially, Republican-minded people started trying to throw as many dinner parties as they could and as large of dinner parties as they could with the hope of getting a movement going. In January of 1848, the largest banquet that had been held at that point was going to be held in Paris, at which point the government decided to ban banquets. This did not have the effect that the government was hoping it would have. By February, instead of enjoying some good food, those Republicans will be rioting. Now, the Industrial Revolution was making impact all across Western European cities, not just French ones. Greater masses of marginalized people were being brought together, and people have power in large numbers if they can get those large numbers to act together. In the 1840s, there was an economic recession across Europe, and there was famine in several countries. You might have heard of the Great Irish Potato Famine, the one that killed about 1 million people, starved about 1 million people to death, and caused more than 2 million people to just leave Ireland in the hopes of being able to make money somewhere else to send it back home so their families could actually buy food. This is when the Irish first started showing up in the United States in large numbers for the first time, though the United States is not the only place that the Irish went. And you got to keep in mind, when this recession was hitting and when food was more expensive because of bad harvests, remember that the Industrial Revolution had broken down old social structures. People living in cities didn't have the supports of their villages, and quite often many of them were folks who had just left the village to the city to find work, and they didn't have the support of their families around them. And so what ended up happening was new social units ended up replacing the old ones. The old social units of your family and of your village were replaced by your class, the group of people that you worked with, and increasingly your nation, the people that you had a broad identity with. In January of 1848, protests broke out in Sicily. The island of Sicily was part of a kingdom that was actually called the Two Sicilies, and this included both southern Italy, which was ruled from the city of Naples, and of course the island of Sicily with its capital at Palermo. And the citizens of Palermo wanted to be their own kingdom with a constitution that gave their parliament a lot of power. The king of the Two Sicilies lived in Naples. The island of Sicily felt like an afterthought. It felt like it was being ruled by afar, and what the citizens of Palermo wanted was to become their own kingdom with a constitution that gave their parliament a whole lot of power. And the king did promise a constitution, but he wasn't going to allow them to be split off from southern Italy. So they took over the city and proclaimed their own nation, the Sicilian nation. And then that February, as we just talked about, Republicans in France took to the streets and they toppled the monarchy rather quickly, set up France's second republic. All of this revolutionary spirit quickly spreads to the northern portion of Italy, all across the Austrian Empire. Remember, there's all these different nationalities or all these different languages that are being spoken across the Australian Empire, and they didn't all want to be grouped together. And of course, there were plenty of revolutions staged in major German cities. Though in these cases, it was a bit different than the revolutions that were taking place in Austria. The places in Austria were all about getting their own identity, breaking off from that multi-ethnic empire. The citizens in all these German cities wanted to bring Germany together so they could have a powerful German state, one which would be controlled for and be for the nation, the people, not the kings. And the folks that were staging these revolutions had learned a lot from the French. These workers and middle-class folk were setting up barricades in the streets, taking over whole cities, sometimes just part of cities, proclaiming new republics. And of course, you've been introduced to Karl Marx. He was alive during this time, and he was super excited. He published the Communist Manifesto that February, just as the first couple revolutions had started, before all the rest really got going. And he quite prophetically opened up that manifesto with the line, "A specter is haunting Europe," though he mistakenly goes on to say, "the specter of communism." He wasn't quite right there. The spirit of revolution was clearly in the air, and he was clearly in touch with whatever it was that was bubbling up to the surface at that point, because again, he's talking about this before most of the revolutions really get going. But these revolutions were revolutions of nationalism, not of communism. We will come back to some of those communist revolutions, though. There's going to be some important ones in the 20th century. These revolutions of 1848, though, for the most part, were doomed to fail. And they really were kind of like the various stages of the French Revolution, but fast forwarded. You might remember 1789 to 1792 was the liberal portion of the French Revolution, where they had their constitutional monarchy. 1792 to 1794 was the radical portion, that reign of terror where all the revolutionaries started turning on themselves. And then 1794 to 1799 was that conservative portion of the French Revolution where the oligarchy won out again. Well, in the spring of 1848, these revolutions looked really successful. Monarchs were on the run. Separate cities were reaching out to each other to form nation states. But by the time we get to the summer, infighting was breaking out amongst the revolutionary governments. Sometimes this division was along class lines, the middle and working classes disagreeing on things like property rights. The middle class folk were usually liberals. They wanted broad freedoms, but they also wanted the right to accumulate large fortunes. They were capitalists. The working class, the people that were actually fighting most of these battles, were usually socialists. They wanted economic regulations that protected them from extortion and abuse by their economic overlords. They wanted to be able to profit from their own work. And beyond these class lines, some of the issues were just nitpicking election systems or not being able to agree on the wording of constitutions. And this is the problem with revolutionaries. They're not usually good at compromising. And if you want to have a functioning democratic state, you have to have compromisers. But revolutionaries, those are usually people with principles that they are not willing to bend, even if it means the whole revolution will end up failing if they don't. And by the time we get to the fall of 1848, reactionaries started gaining the upper hand. Oligarchs, nobility, grand bourgeoisie, they were able to raise larger armies and they were able to push back against these revolutionaries that were fighting with themselves more than with the systems they were trying to change. By 1850, just about all those nascent republics had been conquered. A lot of those revolutionaries, particularly the ones in Germany and the ones in the Austrian Empire, ended up coming to the United States in order to escape persecution for their actions and also to pursue democracy. A lot of those northern soldiers that fought during the Civil War, they were either Irish folk that had just escaped that famine or they were German folk that were escaping persecution for being revolutionaries. But out of all these failed rebellions, there was one major exception. The French had successfully booted out their king in 1848. But the provisional government that had been set up was pretty conservative. Remember, they threw out their king, but they didn't throw out like the grand bourgeoisie, the major property holders of the kingdom at that point. And as a matter of fact, that summer, the lower classes, those same folks that usually have more leftist, socialist ideas, almost brought down the republic that they were just setting up that summer. Similar issues that have been tearing other places apart, where you had people in Paris that just weren't happy with this conservative direction that the government was going. And so those two groups turned on each other. They found a way out, though. Once a new constitution was made for this new republic, presidential elections were held that year in December of 1848. In this constitution, and in this Second French Republic, it was decided they would have a presidential system, a system where the people could directly elect in their head of government, instead of just electing in a representative to parliament. And this was actually kind of a genius move because the rich folk were still able to put forward their candidates that they can make to look like they're the men of the people, but are still going to end up doing what the rich folk want them to do. And indeed, those rich folk did find somebody that the vast majority of the masses were willing to vote for. A nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, 40-year-old Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. But as soon as Louis Napoleon was elected in, he proceeded to make alliances with grand bourgeoisie families while courting the more conservative ideals of country folk, but still giving enough that the working class didn't rebel against him. And indeed, the countryside didn't support the radicalism of the cities. Should sound familiar as today. Cities have a tendency to be more liberal, countrysides have a tendency to be more conservative. And at this point in history, there was still more people living in the countryside than in the cities. So while the city workers are all gathered together, and so they have that power of masses, if we're talking about just elections, they don't have the same type of voting power as people out in the countryside do. There's fewer of them in the cities. And so in 1851, Louis Napoleon called for a nationwide plebiscite. A plebiscite is just like an initiative or a measure. It's something that all the people get to vote on to make a law instead of going through their legislature. So in 1851, he called for a nationwide plebiscite that would give him authority to change the Constitution, and it passed. And then in 1852, he called for a nationwide plebiscite to make him emperor. And that passed. And I gotta say, all of this deja vu is a little head-spinning. I mean, the way that the revolutions of 1848 really mirrored the original French Revolution of liberalism, infighting with radicalism, and then falling to the richer conservative folk, or France setting up a republic and then getting a Napoleon in charge of that republic, and then that Napoleon making himself into an emperor, getting rid of the republic so they're underneath a monarch again. It is taking a while for Europe to figure out democracy. This, of course, began the Second French Empire, which lasted from 1852 to 1870. Napoleon, who is now being called Napoleon III, Napoleon II is a side story that we don't need to get into, reigned the entire time. And once again, he put the kibosh on the revolutionary masses, conservatism won the day, and the state was again ran by a dictator. Stay tuned for part 2.